Today, one of Time magazine's most 100 influential people alive. He started investing at age 12 and now has over $160 billion under management. It's no surprise he's known as the Steve Jobs of investing. On this episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show, we not only discuss investing in the macroeconomy, the current recession, and the COVID economy, but also radical transparency, decision-making, mental models, and perhaps most importantly, why Ray is partly responsible, love it or hate it, for bringing the chicken McNugget into the world. Enjoy this episode on The Jordan Harbinger Show with Ray Dalio. There are so many places to begin with a Ray Dalio interview, so instead of just focusing on radical transparency, which we'll get to, I wanted to dive into something first that you've written more recently about the changing world order, which sounds ominous and maybe is. I thought it was interesting that somebody who does investing that maybe some would consider short-term was so interested in cycles that were longer than our lifetimes in some instances.
Well, I learned a long time ago through a lot of different experiences that the things that surprised me most were things that hadn't happened to me in my lifetime before, but happened many times before that. Like in 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and the United States couldn't, the currency was linked to gold. The United States couldn't pay its debts, and it basically defaulted on its obligation to pay for its gold. And I thought, that's a crisis. I went down on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and expected, terrible results. And I saw that the stock market was up a lot. And I realized that what happened that evening, when Richard Nixon, August 15th, 1971, when that evening he did the exact same thing that Franklin Roosevelt did on March 5th, 1933, which was to break the link with gold and to devalue. And I learned that if I didn't have an understanding of things, important things in the past, like how the Great Depression happened and so on, that I would be surprised. And so I needed to, and I need to today.
Surprise seems like the enemy of investing in many ways.
Right.
You wrote 18 months ago, this is a couple months ago now, 18 months ago, I undertook a study of the rises and declines of empires, their reserve currencies, and their markets, prompted by my seeing a number of unusual developments that hadn't happened before in my lifetime, but that I knew had occurred numerous times in history. This was in March. Global pandemic has to be on that list now. I don't know if it was when you wrote the piece, but I think now it's very clear that this is an event that has happened before, but not during our lifetime.
It's of course it is. And I didn't have that one on the list because the last one that happened was in 1918,
Mm-hmm.
and it happened right at the end of World War I. And so its effects, I confused. I didn't see it. It didn't show up in the numbers because of the economic impact that it had and the life impact it had was sort of happened at the same time as the war impact and the post-war impact. So I missed it. And it's so true, it's happened repeatedly. And so as a result, I've studied a whole bunch of them, or tried to study as many as possible. But there are things like droughts and floods and acts of nature and so many different things that go beyond regular economics that have the biggest impact on our lives because they cost more lives than wars. And wars cost a lot, and we're not even acquainted with any of that. Today, how many pandemics, wars, depressions, revolutions, and so on have we been through? And they happen over and over again for the same reasons.
You said your biggest mistakes in your career came from missing big market moves that hadn't happened in your lifetime, but had happened many times before, just like we were discussing here. A lot of people are like this with the pandemic, the recession we're undoubtedly in right now. I think a lot of folks are saying, well, I'm 58. This hasn't happened to me before, so it can't really be happening right now. And this is not like a conscious thought. It's just the underlying. And we see it manifest when people are like, oh, this is all overblown. It's a hoax, or it's not really that big of a deal. And I think it's just like, it's a cognitive bias. It's like denial. Like, I've never seen this, so it can't possibly be happening and it can't possibly be this bad.
Well, I think we should say, what are the things we're talking? What is it?
Hmm.
What are the three? There are three big things that are happening now that haven't happened in our lifetimes before, but happened last time in the 1930 to 45 period. And they are first, um, um, a long-term debt cycle that turns to the point where central banks can no longer ease monetary policy by using interest rates and so on. And so we're at the end of a long-term debt cycle in which there has to be a lot of printing of money, much like in March 1933. And that's a topic.
Hmm.
Number two, that there are wealth and opportunity gaps and values gaps, which are very large. So, number one, where we are in the debt cycle. Number two, that there are large gaps, and those are the sort of things that produce some form of revolutionary changes. And number three, there's a rising power that is comparable to the existing world power that is challenging it, like in the 30s and in the United States now with China. And so I think when we look at the world, we have three big topics that we need to talk about. There are more. There is technology and there is climate change and so on. But let's start with those three. Those three have not happened in our lifetime, and they're very big and important to understand.
Yeah, this is a lot of us don't have a blueprint for this in our experience, so we maybe try to sweep it under the rug or ignore it. But debt, low interest rates, super high unemployment, the wealth gap. I mean, these are all things you've mentioned, and we can dissect some of those later on as well. We could spend the whole show talking about that. So I want to be careful that we don't, because your piece, which we'll link in the show notes on LinkedIn, does a really good job of that. Um, you said, I believe the reason people typically miss the big moments of evolution coming at them in life is that we each experience only tiny pieces of what's happening. We are like ants preoccupied with our jobs of carrying crumbs in our minuscule lifetimes instead of having a broader perspective of the big picture patterns and cycles and the important interrelated things driving them, where we are in the cycles, et cetera. So humans are repeating this pattern in history. And you said the only thing that changes are the clothes the characters are wearing and the technologies they're using. I'm paraphrasing here, of course. That's a little scary somehow.
Well, why isn't I think scary means not understanding what is true and
Mhm.
how to deal with it. So the question is that true? What I'm saying is when you look at the personalities through history, the personalities don't change. The basic dynamics doesn't change. A debt cycle doesn't change. Conflicts don't change. Empires rise and decline. All of these things change. Wars happen. I mean, it would be naive. Being naive is scary.
Mm.
Okay. So I think the question is this true? And then how do you best deal with it? That makes it less scary.
So you've said this is a stress test. I mean, is this something that I think a lot of people want to know? Is it inevitable that we're going to run into these problems and not handle them well, or is it, hey, look, we have enough advance notice, we can work our way around this, or do you just see the decline of the United States in the future?
Um, Sort of the truth lies in between that. So, um, by being aware of what is health, what is strength, what is the nature of what's happening, so that you can be aware of the choice of being stronger and dealing with these things well is a power, is a great asset. So that's why I'm passing this along for
Mhm.
people to assess it. At the same time, um, you don't begin from scratch. So there's a cycle. And so, for example, the amount of debt that we have, we have. The amount of savings we have, we have. So if you were to take a location, let's say a state, I'll give that as an example. You could take the state of Connecticut, you could take a state, and you could say, well, it's not like you're beginning with a fresh slate. You do carry liabilities and you have circumstances, and that's going to necessitate a heavier lift because you have to produce productivity. Like it's a timeless and universal truth that what you get to consume and the quality of your living standards is a function of your productivity. And so you have to be able to mechanistically make the pie grow through productivity. And you have to be able to divide the pie well so that people believe, and it is a reality, that there's something approaching equal opportunity that's good for the majority of people. So you have those are realities. And then you're faced with your existing circumstances. And then how do we work together to achieve those things? Or will we be at odds with each other and simply fight to our detriment?
Are you optimistic about us getting through this intact? Or like, if you had to assign a percentage to it, would you be? Are you able to do that?
Um, Let me define what is it and how long does it take?
Sure.
Okay.
Hmm.
Um, Inevitably, we will get through this. Meaning, if you look at the cycles and you look at periods, difficult periods, that most difficult period in the 1930 to 45 period, it led to all sorts of difficult stuff, bad stuff, and wars and all that. But you ended it. You got past it. There's a new power, and things resolve themselves, and you enter a new period. And so the capacity of humans to adapt and change and do things in certain ways is enormous. Um, so, but the likelihood of being able to work in an intelligent, cooperative way to do the right things in the system that we have under the circumstance that we have would have to be considered a long shot.
That's yeah. That's that's a little unnerving. I mean, do you feel that way, or is it just this is the way that it is, and we have to just accept it and move on and not have a feeling about it?
Um, I think we now deal with psychology. And the human species basically has the two parts to their brain. They have their logical part, and then there's the emotional part. And you don't want to let the emotional part stand in the way of the logical part in order to make the best decisions possible. You know, like I'm an emotional person, but I have to deal every day in markets and make different decisions. And if I let that emotional hijacking take place, I would be in a bind. So when I look at such things, I gain more comfort and confidence of thinking about, well, what is true, and reality works the way reality works. It doesn't work the way we wish it would work.
Mhm.
So we have to understand that. And when you start to understand how reality works, there's also a beauty to it. It's a perpetual motion machine. So for me, I'm very uncomfortable if I'm not doing that.
I would love to hear what your take is on China because we're talking a little bit about debt. China's drowning in it, and you've been going to China since the '80s, right?
1984,
Yeah,
35 years. Yeah.
that's incredible. I mean, you probably know more about that than most people.
I've been there more times than I can imagine. And yes, so I would hope so. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. What was China like in the 80s? I mean, I know you set up like the first, would you call it private equity organization in China, but I've been to
I,
China.
I when I first went to China in 1984, it was just opening up. Um, Mao died in 76, 1978. Deng Xiaoping came and they had an open door policy and so on. I was invited by a company by the name of CITIC, which was the only company that was allowed to deal with the outside world. It was called a window company. And they wanted to learn about the financial markets. And what it was like was it was very, everything was one or two stories, very poor. I would bring $10 calculators as gifts to high ranking people, and they thought they were miracle devices. And it was very ignorant of what the outside world was like, and it was very backward. On the other hand, it was very intelligent and very the people were very intelligent and very civilized. Along the way, I sent my son when he was 11 there to go to school in an all Chinese school, and I saw what they were like, the eagerness to learn. They were very cultivated, civilized people who had been isolated from the rest of the world for a long time and were very ignorant of the things they needed to do in order to raise their living standard.
Going to school in China must have been an incredible experience. Do you recommend people seek out these extremely unique experiences? I mean, you could have sent your kid to France to go to school, but you knew China was something special.
Each has their own belief of these things. I I believe that when you can see things from a very different perspective, it broadens your ability to see things from different perspectives and to weigh things. And I think it's exciting. That's my own taste, preference. And so I thought it will stretch my son. It'll stretch his thinking. It'll be a great growing experience. And in his lifetime, China will be quite something. The whole journey from that day until today has been a remarkable journey. And so, of course, I wanted to send him there. But, I had conversations with my wife who said, "Are you kidding? We're going to send our 11-year-old to China?" To be clear, he lived with a woman and her husband that we knew for many years before that. And she was wonderful. And he knew her. But it was a poor um, situation because everybody was poor then. So, like, he could only take hot showers twice a week because they only had hot water twice a week, and he had to go to a school that was very poor but very inclined to want to learn and value their kids. So the environment was a healthy environment. But yes, I knew it would stretch his mind, and I thought that was good.
I agree. I mean, I've done a lot of studying and traveling abroad, and I went to North Korea on a vacation 4 times and ran a company that worked there, and people thought I was crazy. But I agree with you. Like having that outside perspective that nobody else has gives you an angle that nobody else has.
Yeah, and it's also so damn flavorful.
Hmm.
So interesting and flavorful, right? It's almost like being in a character in an Indiana Jones movie. It's ooh, it's real.
Hmm.
And it gives you the perspective. So anyway, it's depends what your tastes are like.
I heard you helped bring the chicken McNugget onto the market, so I'd love to hear that story. On behalf of the Western world, thanks for that. I mean, I think we all love a chicken McNugget. How did that happen?
Well, I formed Bridgewater then. It was
Hmm.
a rinky-dink little company, and I was advising on commodities because commodities was my thing. And so the largest chicken producer in the United States was a client of mine, and so was McDonald's. And the problem with that they had at that time to make a chicken McNugget is if the cost of chickens varied a lot, if they put it on the market and chicken prices rose a lot, then they'd have to raise their menu prices, and they didn't want to do it. I mean, it would be a big deal.
Hmm.
So what I did is I knew uh, I had sort of enough of a unique understanding of pricing, markets, and the mechanics of growing chicken to know that we could lock in the grain price and go to this large chicken producer, and they could cover themselves against their cost, make a fixed price contract, and that McDonald's could have a fixed price on the menu, and that they could do the chicken McNugget. So that's how that happened.
So basically, they smoothed out the cost of chicken, and the moral of the story is they're actually made out of chicken, which I think is a relief to a few people listening to this.
Yeah, actually, at McDonald's, my contact with McDonald's, which has since ended, but all through that, they wanted to use fresh beef. They would always use quality. I'm not involved for decades, but back then, that's what their approach was.
Good hedge. um, you mentioned the happiest people discover their own nature and match their lifestyle to it. That's a whole topic in itself. But I wonder how do you suggest we start this process?
Well, I mean, I think first is to recognize that different people have different natures, different deeply seated uh, preferences that will become manifest in what brings them angst and what brings them pleasure. And then I would say, then personality profile tests and so on is a process by which there's scientific processes that will test your preferences for what do you like in your way of thinking and so on. I've use these. I've run my company for 40 some odd years. I don't run it anymore. But I've used those and I've learned a great deal about the people, and they've learned a great deal about themselves. So I'm in the process of combining those tests and making a new test, which I'm going to make available for everybody free. But I would start there and recognize those differences. And then through a process of the interactions, you'll feel your pulls and you and if and your what repulses you, and then you will also think about it. In other words, go above yourself. Not Don't just be in the emotions, but think about the emotions that you're feeling and so on, and maybe have the input of others. Work yourself through differences. Like I think there's an emotional reaction to disagreeing.
Yes.
That's so stupid. Okay. Um, if one could calm oneself down and understand the art of thoughtful disagreement, the capacity to see how others see things, and to then understand those differences, it's enlightening, because once you understand yourself and you understand what others like, it defines your path and also your relationships with others.
I think you called that in the book reluctance. Don't mistake disagreement for conflict and thus avoid disagreement. And I think a lot of us do this. I now lean into conflict, perhaps a bit too much if you ask some of those who work with me every day. But I certainly know that I used to do this. It would be like, I should say something, but I don't want them to get mad at me. So I'll just sweep this problem under the rug for 3 years or whatever. Not a good strategy.
Not a good strategy, because obviously you don't understand each other, and obviously you're not dealing with the issue. If instead you sort of go above you and the other person, and you say, how what do you want me to do? Like, I've got some thoughts, that should I be honest with the thoughts? Can we honestly and thoughtfully exchange those thoughts? Or do you want me to hold on to those thoughts, which might be right or wrong? And they're critical thoughts. I mean, I'm sure you have some critical thoughts about me or what we're doing together, but can we talk about it, or can we not talk about it? So if I think whenever I'm in a conflict with somebody, or any two people are in a conflict, they would be wise to pause the conflict and then go above it and say, okay, what are our ground rules for interacting? How should we interact? What do we want to achieve? Do you want to be ignorant, or do you want to move forward with a discussion? And then once those ground rules are established, then you go back into the conversation and move forward. Because being ignorant, and particularly being critically ignorant, I do find unethical. Because if I have a critical view about you or something and I haven't discussed it with you, it's like trying a person in your brain. Everyone has the right to face their accuser, so to speak, and to work things through. And when you do that, when curiosity is your main motivator, it will enlighten you. You will learn so much more, and you will deal with the realities that exist.
You said to succeed in the market, one needs to be an independent thinker and bet against the consensus, which involves being wrong a lot. So if we're sort of attached to being right and we can't hear about being wrong, it seems like a really good strategy to lose a ton of money investing if you if you can't handle
Yeah,
it.
well, it's also a good, yes, that's right. And it's a good strategy for having a much worse life than you can have regardless of your profession. I mean, in other words, you have a choice. You can follow and obey, or you can follow this other path, which means thinking for yourself while being radically open minded so you're not blind to things. I recommend the second path.
I found it interesting that you say making money is a bad goal. You should find out your real goals and then go backwards from there. How do we start that process? Because I think a lot of people who don't have financial security, they're like, what are you talking about? Making money is a bad goal. It's the only one that makes a difference for me right now.
Well, that's what I'm trying to convey. So let me clarify
Mhm.
what I mean by that. Money has it has a purpose. You want to have security for you and your family. You want to have choices. So it's a very important thing. But look at the things themselves. Okay. So if there are people who get hung up on making money and they almost lose sight of the things themselves, and that's a tragedy. So you have to have the best life possible. That's the main thing. If you have the best life possible and it's some clarity as to what that is, and you're using money to help get there, that's terrific. Great. But don't make money itself the goal.
I think that's wise counsel from you're in a unique place to say that, having probably ostensibly been on both sides, right? You know, having not as much and then having a lot and knowing what's valuable.
I I've been so lucky. In 1982, I was so broke I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help pay for family bills. And so I was very lucky. I was raised my dad was a jazz musician, as you said, and and it was simple background. And then I had my game, my adventure, and it just happened to be the game I loved, happened to be a game that made money. I didn't go into it particularly, I didn't go into it for money. I was too naive to even think about money at the time. But then I acquired it, and so I had the experience in the right order. I had the full range of experiences, and it's a better order to go from up rather than to down. But I felt that those experiences along the way, and I'm 71 years old, and I look back and I think about what matters most. Okay, and I would say, like I said in the book, meaningful work and meaningful relationships have for me been the most important things. And I do want the security for my family, and I want to be able to have freedom. And then on the increment, when you start to get more money than that, then the questions are, what do you choose?
Mhm.
And I choose other things, but I'm not working for money.
Besides happiness, what things do most people think are connected to wealth, but in your experience are really not connected to wealth?
I think people think that wealthy people um, and successful people think they're wealthy and successful, and they generally don't. I should explain that one.
Yeah.
I'll start by explaining that one, but there are a few more. Um, Successful people, um, there's always more to learn. There's always more better to be. They're not the type of people, generally speaking. I'm speaking from experience of being able to speak to the most successful people in the world. They're by and large curious and excited about making magic happen. They're excited about visualizing things and making them happen. And they're very curious. And they are worried about being wrong, which helps them minimize them being wrong by being able to triangulate with other people, which is also why we speak to each other. So they are not sitting there thinking, wow, because in today and throughout history, there are many more successful people and you admire them so that they don't feel that way. And in terms of feeling rich, um, when um, when there's so much you want to do, for example, you become philanthropic.
Mhm.
In other words, you get to the point where the marginal benefit of protecting you and your family is you're past that, and then you've got more, and you don't want decadence, and it's harmful and so on. So you want to move beyond that. You can empathize with others. You can relate to that. And so you want to do things philanthropically. You see some of those needs and so on. And you realize how inadequate your resources are relative to the desires to have those impacts. I mean, for example, we're in the state of Connecticut. I'll just give it a quick example. We're in the state of Connecticut, which has my wife is particularly caring of what are called disengaged and disconnected high school students. A disengaged student is someone who has an absentee rate of greater than 25% and in failing classes. And so school is failing for them. They may not get through high school. And disconnected is someone that they don't even know where they are. They're gone out through the system. And we have a situation here today that those students in high school can't be educated because they don't have computers and they don't have connectivity. And the state has inadequate money to provide those things. Okay. Well, in our case, we went out, we bought 60,000 computers and we're trying to get them connectivity and we're working with others in order to do that. But, that costs a lot of money.
Yeah. That's a lot of
And so
computers.
when we think that cost us a little over $20 million. And when we think about that and we think about I'm just trying to say, if you ask Bill Gates, does he have enough money relative to the needs, he would feel he doesn't have enough money. He's got more than enough money for himself. But the question is how to do those things well. So I think those are the two most obvious things. They don't feel uniquely successful like people imagine. They don't feel uniquely rich like they imagine.
They just have goals that, so it sounds like when you get to, well, at any level, probably your goals outpace your resources to accomplish those goals. And if you get more resources, seemingly the most of anyone, you still have goals that are bigger than the amount of resources you have.
Right. And I think that starts from day one
Yeah.
for certain people. I mean, I'm not saying even that's the right path, by the way. There's an alternative path, which is, um, there's two extremes. Um, Accomplish and have impact that's beneficial on the world, or save her life. Um, Neither path is better. I can't say what path is better. Savor life means just each day smell the roses. Don't be so focused on doing the other, the accomplishing, the learning. Don't be hungry. It's almost Buddhism. In other words, just take that. And I can't say which is better. I enjoy both. I try to get much of both in as possible. So, yeah, you face these types of choices.
Well, much like Buddhism, I think the balance is there, right? I mean, Buddhism also has elements of focusing on well, I'm going to butcher this, but focusing on yourself and focusing on what's going on in your own life, and of course, helping others is a core tenet of any religion or any practice.
Well, what I was speaking about is the absence of needs.
Mm-hmm. Sure, it's more,
Okay.
yeah,
Um, in other words, the you know what I mean, the
yes.
absence of needs.
Yeah, that's a train we could go down for hours with the with that. That may be part of your next giant LinkedIn piece or your next book, depending on what you're working on right now. Are you writing any more books? Are you planning on doubling down on principles or anything like that?
Well, this series that I'm putting out now I'm writing this book on the changing world order because I think it's important for me to
Hmm.
pass that along. And it's research I'm doing for myself. But now at 71, I'll be 71 in August. I'm passing things along that I think are important. So that's sort of a book.
Hmm.
It's a research piece that is being converted into a book, but people could see it on LinkedIn. And then I have to pass along the economic and investment principles because that's an area that I had, I suppose, enough of a unique understanding to that I'd like to pass along. And then I'll be done. I suspect I'll be done and go quiet in about 2 years.
Really? Wow. Well, good thing we got you when we did, I guess. Uh, Thanks for doing that. I know you have the whole book Principles has been, you've talked about it a lot. People should read it. We'll link to it in the show notes along with the Changing World Order LinkedIn post will be in there as well. I do, of
By
course.
the way, you can also, if you want, there's an app called Principles in Action. That's right now it's on the Apple iOS store for free. That has also the book in it, and it also shows some of these principles in action. So you can get that for free, or you could buy the book, or do whatever you want.
Yeah, I recommend people definitely check out the app, but also don't think, oh, I got the app, so I don't need to read the book. Obviously, a deeper explanation is going to be suitable.
Well, I'm saying the book is in the app.
Oh, the whole book is in the app as well. Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
So
Oh,
you
wow.
get yeah. If you want that, and it's on your iPhone, it's handy. But anyway, either way, if they, there are different ways of getting it.
I just wanted to touch on that because I'm going to move along past the principles pretty quickly, and I don't want people to think I left the best part out or that I'm leaving them in the dust here. The principles are, what would you call these? Systems, rubrics for making decisions based on inputs, or is that too basic?
Well, that's good. I would say recipes. Um, in other words, we encounter things, and everything has happened before many times. And so through those encounters, there's sort of our recipes for success. When you're in this situation, what should you do? You can go get them from others. You can come up with them yourself. What I did in my early days of running Bridgewater is reflect on what I was doing, and I also took videos of it and had everybody take videos of themselves doing whatever thing. But most importantly, I reflected on what principles I would use for certain circumstances. I wrote them down and I shared them with the people I worked with and shared my life with. And then I said, would you handle it the same way? Would you use the same principle? So we went from individual cases of things happening and decisions to reflecting on what recipes would you use for certain circumstances. And so I would say they're recipes for different circumstances. And everybody has principles. Every successful person, if you were to say, how did Steve Jobs do things? He's got the actions he took in certain circumstances, or he'd take anybody, a Nobel Prize winner or something, and you want those principles. So I wrote down mine. I think it's important that people have their own. And I think it would be good for people to exchange principles and say, so I'm pulling them out also of other accomplished people, so that, and we're going to have on that principles in action, we're going to have the possibility that people can search for the most appreciated principles for the circumstances they face, or they could say, what are Bill Gates's principles or XYZ principles, and then you could do that. And it also makes it easy for people in that app to write down their own principles and then have easy access with them. So that's what principles are: recipes for success of how you'd handle certain circumstances.
So we classify situations into a type so we know how to handle it and we aren't reacting every time we see these like we're seeing it for the first time.
Exactly. It's like, what species is it? Okay, what species of thing is it? Okay, now that I've identified that species, how do I best handle that species to get the best results?
You've said my success has more to do with how I handle what I don't know than what I do know. And that comes from the principles, right? You see something and you say, like you said, it's a species. All right, I've seen these elements of this problem or situation before, therefore these principles apply. Therefore, we know more or less how to handle this, or at least we have a start. We're not just panicking and running around in circles trying to figure out what's going on for the first half.
Well, I'd like to separate those two parts. The principles are, again, learn from wherever you can the best ways to handle things. But the first point, which is whatever success I've had in life, has had more to do with my knowing how to deal with what I don't know than anything I know, is just a reality, which is what any person can know is only a small fraction of the best thinking, the best knowing that exists. And so being trapped in one's head and thinking that you necessarily have the right answer or the best answer for handling something is to almost intentionally be blind. And so when you deal with how do I get the best knowledge, or even when you think, what don't I know and how do I deal with not knowing well? For example, diversifying. Like, you can hold a portfolio and you can have an opinion about what thing is going to do well and what's going to do poorly, and you can be wrong. So knowing that you can be wrong means, how do I diversify well in a way where it doesn't lessen my returns, but it lessens my risk? So thinking about what you don't know and how to deal with that well is incredibly effective in being able to be successful.
Usually, and I think you touched on this earlier, usually we get our principles, or often we get our principles elsewhere, maybe from our parents, other structures. But if we don't examine these principles and make them our own, we may act in ways that are not in alignment with our goals and objectives. And because we're taking our principles from other people with different goals and different objectives. So, how do you go about making the principles your own, or how do we know if a principle we have is even in alignment with our own goals? Obviously, we have to define our goals first.
Reflecting. Okay. When you encounter something, think for yourself, reflect. I have an expression: pain plus reflection equals progress. I believe that um, you're in that situation. When you have pain, something's wrong. It probably reflects how reality works or your realities. And if you can reflect in a quality way on how reality works and how you should interact with it most reflectively, most effectively, you will develop a principle, write it down for moving ahead. And so I think it's that reflecting process. You may choose not to do that. I mean, I think that's the best because it aligns you with your principles. People have those different preferences, but it's knowing how to reflect well. And I think, by the way, I should mention that I think that meditation is a terrific thing that helps people calm themselves down and gain an equanimity and helps them go more into a thoughtful, reflective mode and escape some of the emotional hijackings that they have.
There's a lot here. You'd also said that good habits come from thinking in a principled way, such as learning a language, but good thinking comes from exploring the reasoning behind principles. So good thinking being different from good habits comes from what? Examining these principles and then going, why is this way? Why do we do this? Am I oversimplifying this?
No, by and large, it's as I say, it's reflecting in a quality way with, if it's important, the help of smart others to triangulate with. And so, if you were thinking, how do I deal with that situation? Um, you step back and you say, what are my realities? How do they work? And you triangulate with maybe others and you say, who are good reflectors, don't triangulate with anyone,
Mhm.
and then learn and whatever, and then go to principles and move forward. So I think that's the basic process.
I will recommend to people to go check this out, especially regarding radical transparency. The idea that you can put your thoughts on the table, honestly, have thoughtful disagreement with people where you're willing to shift and have this idea meritocracy both at work. And I wonder, Ray, do you practice this with your family, or is it more like, okay, there's emotions involved here that we can't separate because it's a family situation versus an investing situation? Or do you have radical transparency even at home?
Um, I behave the same way in that I enter into, because I believe it's best, I reach an agreement with others of how we should behave with each other. In other words, the same issue of, would you like me to do that? Would you like me to talk? Do you talk? Can we exchange things? What is our way of operating going to be like? Because in personal lives, it also can be very important. So there will be disagreements. What do you do with a disagreement? How do you approach a disagreement? How do you get past a disagreement? And so I think you need to have ground rules to not talk about things. Um, is to leave oneself in a state of confusion and an unresolved state. Now, I'm not saying everything is 100%. I mean, let me understand. I'm not proactively going out there and telling my wife that her hair doesn't look good or something. I'm not, I'm not, uh,
Yeah.
I don't. So, I mean, but if we going to have conversations, we have to have clarity in terms of how we're going to be with each other within, um, within not 100%, 100% about everything, but
Mhm.
by and large. And I find that much better. We understand each other and we can respect differences, including emotions. In other words, if somebody says, that, that's too emotional now to have a conversation, or I'm sorry, I'm not able to do that. I'm not. It's not my nature, and I don't want to do that. I respect that, and we find our own way of dealing with it.
I think it's interesting and useful that you also practice this with your family and you set these ground rules. Well, I assume you set these ground rules beforehand. Like with your friends, Do you just sort of feel out how much radical transparency they can take, or do you say, "Hey, do you want to talk about this, or would you rather we just leave it alone?" Like, do you set the ground rules explicitly, or is it more implicit?
Well, it's more like when it comes up.
Hmm.
You know, if I'm in a disagreement, um, I ask, let's how do you want to what are we supposed to do with this thing? Or, I mean, how should we react? And of course, it depends on the nature of the relationships. There are times, and you must encounter this, everybody encounters this, that they're even um, important uh, problems and mistakes that others have that you care about. Um, should you discuss them or should you not discuss them? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how should you be? So it's important to get clarity on that. It doesn't, that you can keep them to yourselves or you can pass them along. Generally speaking, it's better to be able to discuss things and work things through and realize that one has emotional hijackings. So when one realizes that and they say, oh, well, I'm experiencing one of those, and maybe this isn't the moment, or this is what's going on, the higher level them can realize that the lower level them is going through that experience. And that in and of itself is a power. So it doesn't have to be done at that moment and so on. And greater awareness of one's emotions and thoughtfulness about how to best approach them is a good thing.
You've said that people must value meritocracy over maintaining power or being right. And I'm paraphrasing here, but otherwise they will change the system to get what they want intentionally or unintentionally through their actions. When you have people in your organization or even just in a social situation or family, do you find yourself trying to decide which or pick out which one of these types of people they are? Or are these types of people the ones that want to maintain power or be right and the ones that want to value meritocracy? Or is this kind of a skill set that you build within a relationship?
I think it's both, like, and I'm very, evidence based.
Hmm.
So, what I mean is there's the good of the organization, and every system has got to be fair. And a decision making system is fair if it's a meritocracy. So, if you can believe in your organization that the best people with the best ideas will win out, and that you're working for a common purpose, which is the well being of the organization that you will then share in, and that truth about strengths and weaknesses matters. If you believe those things, and by the way, they're great things not only to believe into, but to make happen. If you can believe in those things, and then you're going on and you're seeing, well, the individual is working for themselves or their own interest, or they're attached to being right and believing that they're right without merit, then you believe that that's undermining the well being of the community. I believe that. And then you talk about it and you say it and you call it out and you say, is that right? Is that happening? You don't just hold it to yourself, but you say, well, you're faced with this situation. You've made that choice, and those are your choices. But let's be clear about what they are. And so, and then people make the choices, but you have to be straightforward. Like all relationships, there are ups and downs, you know, and how you approach them together is important. Any business has down periods and up periods. Just being clear. Um, how are we good with each other through such things? And what are our choices? Let's say in a down period, something special happens when people are in it with you and they say, I'm going to make it great and I'm not going to jump ship and go to someplace that's more attractive. It would be like a spouse doing that or a pal doing that or something. But that doesn't mean you don't have the right to do that. I don't want to impose mine on yours. So you might say, hey, it's no longer good and I'm going to go. Those things and those ways of being are the things that make a culture. And you can talk about all those things and decide what's going to happen and who you'll be with.
Yeah, you do mention in the book the ego barrier that blocks us from learning, the blind spots that we need to identify within ourselves, and you have a lot of techniques to get down to brass tacks with your Bridgewater team as well. And you've said that the antidote in many ways to those things is that radical open-mindedness, believing you may not have the best possible path, as you said, recognizing that decision making is a two-step process. You've said most people decide too early when they're making a decision and then simply seek to reinforce their existing opinion. And I think that's really good awareness for a lot of folks because that's almost invisible, right? We think I'm making a decision with my team here and we're talking about it and Ray disagrees with me and we're doing this transparency thing. But in the back of my mind, I could have this little pin in, okay, I'm going to let Ray be radically transparent with me, but I already know I already know what's right here. So I'm just going to sort of stick to that and keep bringing it forward over and over and over. We have to be really self-aware to stop doing that and make a better decision.
Yeah. And it's not just within an organization or any organization. Psychologists have shown through tests, it's well known, that people have a lot of biases and they tend to form a conclusion about something and then they filter the evidence to support that conclusion rather than the opposite, which is basically let me take in the conflicting information and accumulate the information to make the best decision possible. So I'm just observing that those two things are true, and that when people do it the first way, that's not in their best interest. They're doing it the second way of trying to take in, to be open minded and to take in various evidence. And then, based on that, with that open mindedness, to then come to the best decision is obviously the logical best thing to do. And so, to know one's human nature and to watch one do the opposite is something people should be aware of.
I assume there's a lot of calling people out when that happens in a meeting or even in a discussion. That you call that out in real time, I assume.
Yeah, but what happens is the modus operandi changes. So it takes all of this just takes a bit of getting used to. And once people get used to it, they just operate in that mode and um, they feel so much better operating that way. It's like a habit thing. It takes about let's say 18 months, like changing habits. We call the process getting to the other side. You first say, "Oh, intellectually, this sounds all great," and so on. But you have to decide for yourself how much do you want. So it's like I don't know, it might be like losing weight or getting fit or something. You have to find the habit developing process that gets your actions aligned with what you want. And that's a big thing in all aspects of life, right? Because the subliminal, emotional, and habit part of what we do really has a bigger influence on us, on most people, than the calm, logical, what is the best choice type path.
Yeah, we really have to suspend judgment, which is really tough, but allows new information in more effectively when we do it.
Yes, and if you have curiosity and you have humility, which means a healthy fear of being wrong, it'll be instinctual. Okay, that's a different point of view. It's held by a smart person. Hmm, why? I'd be like to hear their reasoning. And if that smart person has a different view than me, one of us is probably wrong. How do I know the wrong one isn't me? And so I can raise my probability of being right if I can hear their reasoning.
You've mentioned some tells for bad thinking, for lack of a better term. You wrote in part, over time, you'll hear the same verbal cues indicating that somebody is thinking about something badly or failing to apply principles appropriately. For example, listen to the anonymous "we" as a cue that somebody is likely depersonalizing a mistake. So, is it safe to say that you have a rule to personalize mistakes in service of being better able to address them?
Yes, it's a rule that has exceptions, but right. The depersonalizing mistakes stands in the way of learning, stands in the way of the person's development, stands in the way, of making progress. If you can make people realize that mistakes and failures are just part of the learning process, that it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, while you don't want to go out and intentionally make mistakes, but if you're not making mistakes, you're probably not learning well or adequately, because the best learning, you put your hand on a hot stove, you fall while you're skiing. These are the ways that one learns. And so if you're depersonalizing it and you say, we did something, you're denying that accountability. Like, imagine you had a football team and the guy didn't make the block correctly, and so on. And we said, we, the team, didn't do something right. I mean, you won't get at that guy watching the mistake he made and learning and moving beyond that and then dealing with that so that the team could do better.
What do you think are some other tells for bad thinking that come up? The depersonalizing mistakes, that seems like a solid one. I'm wondering if you have other sort of offhand, when someone does this, typically it's bad thinking.
Well, something like they start with their conclusion and they say, I think, and they leave it as a conclusion without dealing with the reasoning, is something that piques my ear. But also, if they do, I think I did a good job, or I think that perks my ears, because like, nobody's objective about themselves.
Yeah.
And like, I think I did a good job. Well, what does that matter? I mean, like, okay, who doesn't think they did a good job? I mean, is that a compelling argument? I
Yeah.
mean, like, I think I did a good job. Okay, can we open-mindedly look at, did you do a good job or not? So I think I is, one of the cues.
I'm so guilty of that, Ray. You have no idea. I hope we all are, and it's not just me. I feel like I do that every day.
It's common, yeah.
It's
But if you start to hear the cue,
Yeah.
you start to develop the response. Like, if you start to say, I think I did a good job or something, it might trigger.
Hmm.
Um, the pride of that ownership and doing it right is a very common mistake. So I created a terminology in which a person uses, I'm a dumb shit. And so that they can all be relieved of having to be right. Because there's so much judgment on, are you right or not? So I basically want to say, okay, look, let me establish the fact that I'm a dumb shit. I don't know anything about this. I'm ignorant. I'm just trying to learn. Now can I ask my questions? Rather than make it one of those confrontation. And if you see humility in various phrases, you can see it. You know that the person's more likely to be open-minded. Like, do you get questions or do you get assertions? I'm curious when I watch people. Are they giving questions? Oh, those are good questions. Because learners will give you great questions. Smartest people will be the people with great questions. And then you get these people who are incapable of asking good questions. They just make assertions. These are triggers that you can develop an ear for.
I love the concept or the idea. You said seeing a problem and not solving it has the same effect as not identifying it in the first place. And that's kind of sobering and wakes you up, because I think a lot of us have problems that we see, that we ignore, that we sweep under the rug. And you rightly say that almost every problem is a symptom of a larger problem, and that going backwards to find the root of the problem is crucial. I wonder, how do you do that with your team? I mean, how do you take a problem, identify it, or something that's been identified and swept under the rug, and then go directly to the root of that problem?
Well, any problem, you go first to either the person or the system that might produce it, knowing that there is no such thing as perfection. So every system will produce some problems that might happen with a certain degree of frequency. Every great batter strikes out, and so on. So the first thing you want to do is you want to be able to look at that and say, is it operating excellently? You know, what is its standard? And you want to have an excellent standard. But if you see clank, unacceptable problem, you want to go back. It is either produced by the person or the system, or maybe them operating together. So you look at that pattern. You look at the pattern of the person, and you look at the pattern of the system, and you look at the cause-effect relationship that produced it. So you go into this diagnosis phase. Like I said in the book, there are 5 things that you need to do to be successful. If you do these 5 things, you will be successful, and you don't have to do them alone. First, know what your goals are. What are you going after? So that you can prioritize and go after those things, because you can't have everything. You could practically have anything you want, but you can't have everything you want. So you have to know what your goals are. On the way to your goals, you will encounter your problems and obstacles. I guarantee it. Okay. So step 2 is you need to identify and not tolerate the problems that are standing in the way of you getting to your goals. Okay. Step 3 is you have to diagnose them to get at the root cause of them, the specific thing. Okay. And that's what we're talking about. Okay. Is it the person? Is it the nature? They're just not good at it? Is it the circumstances, the design of the organization? What is it? Once you have the diagnosis, okay, that's the cause. That's why depersonalization is not good. You want to say, okay, well, I got it. That, that lineman keeps failing to make the blocks. And so then we now have to deal with it, training or whatever. Then you have to go to then design something different, a change. You have to change things. Otherwise, you won't make improvements. As Einstein said, insanity is doing the same things over and over again and expecting the same a different result. So you have to push through and change things. So that's the process. That's the 5-step process. Nobody can do that alone. They're not all good at everything. But if you know where you're good and where you're weak, and you work well with others who are strong where you're weak, you can do that, and that's the path to success.
By the way, for those listening, we will have that 5-step process outlined in the worksheet for this episode, which will be linked in the show notes. So don't pull your car to the side of I-75 and furiously write that down. We'll do that work for you, and you can get that at jordanharbinger.com. I was surprised to see that you said, well, first of all, humans still make the most important decisions, not computers. That much is clear. But that eventually we will use computers to aid thinking as much as we use our brains right now. That is a very bold claim. You believe
Yeah.
that, eh?
Well, yeah, it's like we used our brains to remember things. That now I can go on Google and I can get the information, and it's almost silly to try to remember,
Mm.
what happened in 1812, those kinds of things. Okay, and if people put online um, cause effect relationships, situations, and so on, you will go online and you'll say, I'm in this situation. What's the best way to handle it? And you will pull up other people's principles. We have on that Principles in Action app, there's a device, which is our rudimentary version of that. It's called a coach. And you say, I'm in this situation. What do you recommend? And it'll pull up principles. And we're going to have it not only populated with my principles, you can put your principles on it, and it'll have other people's principles. And you probably will ask advice for the situations that you're in that will help. And that'll gain a refinement and so
Mm.
on, so that there's this best collective intelligence that you'll be able to take in and consider.
That sounds extremely useful. And I think developing these habits, developing this introspection, creating the rule that, as you'd mentioned, that no one has the right to hold a critical opinion without speaking up, and that correctness should be based in the reasoning of the person arguing for something, not the authority of the person arguing for something. That, by the way, reminded me of my parents saying, well, I'd say, why? And they'd say, because I said so. And no kid is ever satisfied with that. So like 8-year-olds know that there should be some meritocracy, and then somewhere between 8 and 38, it just evaporates.
Well, I think it's such a good example of the difference between the right to know and the right to decide. Like I have my 6-year-old grandson. I believe he always has the right to know. So I appreciate the question. Here's the answer, but don't confuse that with the right to decide. At a certain age, you'll do this, and then you'll acquire. The better you decide, when with time you'll have a right to decide. And I find that this happens. That confusion happens a lot in a lot of people.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about the difference there, that difference in those particular things. I I think that goes to show that, well, looking at the character of an organization, you've said when mistakes and weaknesses are hidden in an organization, poor character is developed. But you also have to, on the other side of that, make sure that any mistakes, weaknesses, bad decisions, or the right to decide versus the right to know are clearly delineated. Otherwise, you just have a messy soup of this is what's happening, and we're still not sure. We're still not sure how we got to that particular outcome.
Yeah, yes, um, but then you have to decide in what degree. And I found that I could do it radically. In other words, what we did is we made everything, vir- virtually everything, unless somebody says this is a personal matter and we really can't discuss it, taped for everybody to listen to, so that anybody could hear any discussions about almost anything. If it's not proprietary and it's not of a certain personal nature, that everybody can hear anything. So, because you don't talk behind each other's backs, and that you explain that kind of thing. Now, I know that that sounds way out there, but the point I'm trying to convey is by being so transparent, you um, you raise a better way of being, because bad things happen in the dark and understanding happens through transparency. And so when people do that well, in other words, if you can't have subversive people in your midst, people who want to hurt each other or something. But if you have that in a way where you can be radically truthful and then test that truthfulness by being transparent, that's an enormous power. Now it's stretching it, but so I'm not saying on day one go there, but I'm just giving you the idea that that's important, and so you don't want to just go to the mess. So knowing the right to understand and the right to make sense of anything is not it's not the same thing as the right to decide. And to know that difference is important.
To be clear for people that don't know about what you meant by everything's recorded. So at Bridgewater, you record all of your meetings so that anybody inside the organization can listen, and you share the hardest things. So this transparency keeps people from losing the trust of other people, because they can hear everything that's going on even behind closed doors, with certain exceptions. And I would imagine it's also harder to get away with doing bad things when you're radically transparent. And this is good for the company in the long run. You've probably
That's
had
right.
very few legal issues because of this.
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. It's so funny because the lawyers, when I started doing this, said, "Are you crazy?
Yeah.
What are you going to do?" But the and I said, "Well, if we're doing something wrong, we should be able to examine it. The right people have to examine it." So it's easy. What we do is we just take the stuff, the tapes, and we show it to people so they don't even have to argue about what was.
Hmm.
You can see it, and then that's how judgments are made.
I think it's probably wise of you to have yourselves examine this internally rather than waiting for a judge, or even a judge and a jury or a grand jury, to examine it for you at
Well,
some point.
but in either case, we want to do everything internally, so we have processes that are mutually agreed to.
Sure.
If there's disagreement, through arbitration and so on. But in any case, you present it to the relevant judges, and they can see it, and that's good.
I wonder, in closing here, do you ever get, do you know what FOMO is? Are you familiar with that term?
No.
Fear of missing out. So like when you read about this, your friend Bunker Hunt, he got super rich from silver, and there was a part of you that was like, oh man, silver, I got out too early. That's what FOMO is, right? Where you're just like, you're kind of crying to yourself about missing an opportunity. And now we get it a lot with social media, where you see your friend on vacation and you're in working, and you feel FOMO. I wonder if you still feel that way at all, either in life or in handling investments, getting out too early, or if you've somehow solved that problem for yourself.
Well, there's the getting out too early was part of what you were saying, but I would take the broader answer to your question of fear of missing out. Um, and I want to distinguish it from envy,
Hmm.
because it sounded like, when you defined it, quite like envy. Okay, they're on the beach or whatever it is. The way I look at it is, I have an enormous appetite, and I want to pack in as much life into my life as I possibly can. And there are so many good things, and that is just the reality. It's like being in a smorgasbord in which you can't taste everything and you really want to. So but it's just the way I view it is, it's just the reality of life. And so, yeah, I do think, okay, what am I wishing? But at the same time, I have to balance that same thing with, I could miss out on savoring the simple things, the most beautiful things. There can be too many choices. And so, okay. And over a period of time, I've learned to balance those things in the way that I do. I'll push this aside, and then I will spend the afternoon with my grandson. And we will, and we will do that, or we'll enjoy what the beautiful day is, knowing, because I intellectually know that there are too many choices to be able. So of course I'm going to miss out, but that's the way life is, and I don't have an anxiety over it. I just accept that that's the way life is.
I think that's healthy. I wonder, have you always been that way, or is that something that you've managed to shape up over time?
I think, no, I've developed, of course. I've always had um, an appetite, a curiosity, a desire to experience a lot of things, do a lot of things, and that kind of thing. But the notion of um, dealing with it and so on is part of the process. And I really do think that what's helped me a lot again is meditation.
Hmm.
Um, I started meditating, well, over 50 years ago and so on. And what it helps me do, it's not just you relax yourself and you don't have stress. When it gives me that and others, it gives them a calmness and equanimity to realize that life just is a bunch of choices. And that's just the way life is. And how do you calmly approach those choices? So I think that had a big effect on my development, and then just my experiencing it. Like I can wish I could do everything. I mean, it's just you can't.
In closing here, I saw your 60 Minutes piece, or part of it, and you'd said income inequality in the United States is a national emergency requiring reform. And you called for a reform of capitalism, described wealth inequality as a national emergency. I mean, that's scary. It's not something, it's also not something you usually hear from one of the world's wealthiest people. So why is this so urgent for you and for us?
Well, because the system is not fair, and it doesn't create um, the absence of equal opportunity, comparable education, and so on, means that a large percentage of the population that could be identified for their talent and could succeed, the great talents may never be identified. And so, if you look at history, you find that when you have large wealth gaps that cause conflict and suboptimal uh, intellectual resource allocation, and then you have bad times, you have revolutions, you have conflicts. And it's apparent to me that that's the case now. When I was growing up, it wasn't like that. But anyway, what happens now is um, I wrote a piece that is, yeah, um, why and how capitalism needs to be reformed. And it has a lot of particulars to it. But for example, the person in the top 40% of the population, I broke the population into the top to 20%, so quintiles. And I looked at the bottom 60% in relationship to the top 40% because I want to look at the majority. And on average, in the top 40%, particularly in the higher group, the amount spent for their children's education is 5 times that in the bottom 60%. And naturally, we want our kids to have good education. But the educational disparity is enormous, the resources and so on. And so I could go on and on about the fact that that doesn't work well. But you have to have productivity at the same time. You can't just have wealth redistributions because whatever we collectively get to consume is whatever we collectively produce. So we have to make the system work so that the pie as a whole grows, productivity grows, and that it is well distributed. Otherwise, when you have a downturn, history has shown it's not sustainable. So it's an emergency. It's not fair. It's not productive, and it's one of our greatest threats.
Well, Ray, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for the chicken McNuggets. Thanks for everything. I appreciate it. Hope you all enjoyed that. By the way, you can find many more episodes in our podcast feed of The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. In the meantime, click here for an interview with Mark Cuban. Click here for an interview with Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google, and click right here to subscribe to the channel.